afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our National Adoption Week webinar on contact with Ellie Haworth. And we've got panellists Emma and Simon today who are going to share their experiences. It is recorded, but it is a webinar format, so we can't see what's going on with you, so you can relax about your surroundings. If you are distracted, it will be recorded and on our members resources area by tomorrow for you to catch up on. Please feel free to interact with the Q&A and I will come at the end with those questions and I'll ask them in an anonymised fashion, so you don't have to worry about what information you're sharing. I won't share any of that with the rest of the viewers. Okay, so thank you very much, panellists, for your time today. I'm going to hand over to them. I'm going to switch my camera off and mute, but I'll still be here in case you need me. But without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Ellie.
Hi, thank you very much. Glad to not see you all, but glad to know you're all out there in webinar land. We've just put a few thoughts together on a PowerPoint presentation to talk about the subject of contact. And I suppose the first thing to say is that the name contact is probably something that's up for debate, and I've just stuck with it because most people know what we're talking about when we talk about contact, but there are friendlier, kinder, more sensitive versions of that word, like family time, keeping in touch, keeping connected. There are ways of talking about contact that are a little bit more child friendly and what we mean, but for the ease of communication, I hope you'll forgive me if we just talk about contact. As Jo said, I'm Ellie Haworth and I'm the Director of Service Delivery here at Adoption UK, but my expertise only goes so far, so I have joining me the wonderful Emma and the delightful Simon, who are both the real deal and can talk about contact from a point of deep understanding, professionalism and personal experience as well. So when you get to questions, I might have to duck all of the complicated questions and hand over to them. If you're happy, then I'll just flick on to the first slide, which is, just thought this would give you an idea of what we're hoping to run through. So my plan was that we'll talk about what contact is, what it could be, what it can be, but also what it is more often than not, what's most likely for people, and really focusing on actually what it feels like for people, how that actually is when you're in a contact arrangement, what it's like for the children, what it's like for the parents, and what it's like for the birth families themselves. And then my idea is that there should be something called reflective contact, so it's not just a transaction that happens, but it's a situation that we learn from and grow from, and actually thinking about it can be used to deepen our relationships and help children make sense of their life story and you know, own themselves and own their place in the world. But maybe that's a bit high-minded, and maybe we ought to just start off with getting letterbox ranges sorted out in time. So you can tell me at the end of it whether you think that my ambition for contact is pie in the sky or something we should be working to. And then ending with just a little think about, it's about you and your families, and you know, what's right for you and what's the right contact levels for you and your family will be something that only you can know when you have the information about your family. So I'm not going to try and give you rules or bully you into submission and tell you there's a specific way that you should be doing contact. Instead, I'll be seeking to say, you know, you're the experts on your family, and what you understand is probably what's going to be best. We would like this to be as a discussion as much as possible, because none of you are actually going to want to hear me drone on. So chuck your questions over to Jo, and I'm presuming Jo will help field them when we get to the end. And if there's anything that we haven't talked about, just let me know and we can bring that to the fore, because it's such a cliche, isn't it, that there's no such thing as a silly question, but we genuinely mean it. No question too big, too small. We will have a go at answering them as best we can. So presuming, because I can't see you all nodding and smiling out there, presuming that you're all okay for me to carry on, I will move on. And I thought I'd start us off with a joyous topic. I love a statistic. I don't know about you, you might be all a bit dated out, but me, I like a statistic. So I just pulled some of the story of contact from our barometer. Hopefully you've all had a chance to read and absorb the barometer. Every year we produce it, and I know Becky's diving into the creation of 2022's barometer already. But some really lovely information comes out regarding contact from the barometer. So in 2021, of the newly formed families, 97% of families, so virtually everybody, had indirect contact agreements in place with birth family members. And 77% were actually willing to consider future direct contact. And I think those are really high numbers. So it shows that we are thinking routinely about contact for those children with their family of origin, with their birth family. And actually adopters as a group are really willing to consider it. What those numbers don't tell us.
Sorry, Ellie, I'm so sorry to butt in. Just the slides aren't moving, so I don't know if you think they're progressing. We're still frozen on
I thought they were. Oh, how do I make them progress then if they're not doing it automatically?
We're still not in presenter view.
Oh, yeah. You are on my screen.
Okay. Maybe if you end share and reshare, possibly.
If I do that.
Yes, lovely.
What can you see now? The little girl.
You can see the green slide, the agenda for the session.
Excellent. Sorry about that. Thank you for
No,
that's really helpful. It's showing in presenter view on my screen. Are you able to see it in presenter view now?
We can see, yeah, we can see the next, like the slide sort of view. We can see.
Oh, okay.
I mean, we can read. That's fine. That's an improvement. We can read what's happening and what's coming up.
I can try fiddling with it, or I might just confuse myself and make everything go wrong if I do that. So, do apologise that it's not.
No, that's perfect. We can see the stats now.
Yes, you can see my stats. I liked my stats, so I want you to see them. What this number, 77%, doesn't tell us is the remaining, what's that, 23%, she says, doing spur of the moment mathematics. Why is it they weren't willing to consider? And I think it's really important to say there's a lot of people for whom there were very good and very strong reasons why they weren't willing to consider direct contact as well. So in highlighting these numbers, I think it's important we don't rush to judge and we understand that there are good reasons and careful thinking behind most people's decisions. And actually what we saw is that in previous years of the barometer, actually the very, very similar numbers emerged. So this isn't a one-off, this isn't a kind of COVID effect and people are just feeling more refreshed and available because of the lockdowns, but actually this is a reasonably predictable pattern now, but newly approved families are actually more and more willing to consider direct contact, and that is an increasing trend. So that's quite interesting to know about. And actually when we looked at established families, the 97% who had the agreements, 81% effectively of people who've got agreements, they were still being maintained by the adoptive parent. So we're out there, we're doing the agreements and we're sticking by them, and I think that's a really powerful message about what's going on in the world of contact. Has that moved on for you? Have you not got a blue screen now? Lovely. Right, so these are some quotes from the barometer. So it's we shouldn't underestimate what contact is and the significance of it has for adoptive families. The majority of the people who were responding to the barometer were really clear that they were keeping up with their indirect contact agreements, but perhaps fairly typically the proportion of people who were sticking to those agreements were reducing as the children got older. So it is something that might be less present and less significant an issue for older children. And it told us when we were analysing the situation that actually there is more support needed if we're going to sustain contact and make the that relationship and that knowledge available to older children as they carry on. More service support is going to be needed. And I think it's a really interesting finding that it's the relationship with siblings that is the most enduring. I'm not entirely sure what conclusions I want to draw from that, and I'd be really keen to hear from you guys as to why you think that's the case. But it's a really interesting finding that actually we were able to protect those relationships most successfully. And we made a recommendation, and I personally would stand by this recommendation quite strenuously, saying actually it's a really important thing that we offer support and training for everybody who's going through the approval and assessment process, that they're given training support in how to support their child around contact arrangements and what they can do, and that any contact plans, that we have the facility to review those regularly, so that the plans are empowered to change as we go through the system. And that's all parties being supported to engage in that review, including the birth family, because we want those plans to be well supported. Hopefully that's not something you particularly want to argue with. I've got a pink slide now. Hopefully you've all come with me onto the pink slide. You might, some more stats and data. What we found was 28% of 13 to 18-year-old children were having direct contact, but that's outside of a formal agreement. So that's quite a substantial proportion of people who are having contact over and above what it was that it was agreed formally with the agencies and support agencies. And 60% of the families who were having direct contact actually felt that that had been a positive experience. Now that is an increase, but I think it's really worth noting that when we talk about children having, certainly teenage children having direct contact, often we talk about that in the context of risk and concerns about unsupervised contact, or children seeking their own contact, or young people putting themselves at risk. So I think while we still definitely need to have those conversations about the risks and the dangers for our children, we also need to make sure that we are saying that in 60% of the times, actually what families who are experiencing it are telling us is that it's actually been overall a positive. And then as we get into older young people, we're seeing that there's a really significant trend of people between the ages of 16 to 25 actually actively seeking to increase their contact or make contact with birth family members. And I think 52% is quite a powerful number there. And again, our recommendation is that we think that training and peer support for all adopters when their children reach 13, can't read, is to help people to manage the changes from that transition from adolescence into adulthood, so that we're not just assuming that the same knowledge that you had when your child was a baby or a toddler or a preschooler is going to be the same information that you need, and that we need that to include online safety, navigating contact, and the different challenges it brings, so that we've got those transitions covered for families there. I'm conscious that I'm really rattling through here, so we'll slow down and get more discursive later on, I promise. I like a graph. I hope you all like a graph. And this is just a breakdown of how the indirect contact agreements and what people are genuinely having. So as you can see, the vast majority of indirect contact agreements are actually with birth mothers, still a very significant proportion with birth fathers, slightly less so with siblings, and then the breakdown is much further. But the number of people who've got no indirect contact and no other types of contact is actually very small. Hope you can't, that's my dog growling, by the way, from underneath my desk, so if he distracts you, I apologise. And then actually when it comes to direct contact, the graph's really reversed, isn't it? Such a different picture. So there's a small proportion who have direct contact with birth mothers, and only a really tiny proportion there, 2 to 3%, are having direct contact with birth fathers. But as we were saying earlier on, the greater amount of direct contact is with siblings, and again, a tiny percentage with wider family members. So the vast majority of children are not having the opportunities of direct contact. And again, there's a lot of hidden story underneath that 62%, isn't there, to tell us the whys and wherefores of that. And if a graph wasn't good enough for you, we also have an infographic. I mean, I'd be hard pushed if you asked me to say whether I prefer an infographic or a graph, but here you are. This is the breakdown of how the split is out between people having contact with their birth mothers, birth fathers, with their siblings, or with other family members. I think there's a whole sociology PhD probably contained in these pictures if everybody wants to get some funding to do that. And then moving us forward, I thought this was really interesting, that this is the levels of participation. So again, I think it's personally, this is for me about saying, you know, adopters are really diligent. Adopters do absolutely what they can to follow through. And as you can see, the highest line is the pink line in all of those answers. So in the majority, in the main, adopters are maintaining their contact with birth mothers, maintaining their contact with birth fathers, and maintaining their contact with siblings and wider family members. And that's, I think that's quite a healthy indicator. And I think we probably ought to be really careful about making sure that message is heard, so that we're representing accurately what it is that adopters are willing to do for their children, and to make this contribution and participation real. And I think this is one more slide of data. So again, this is just another way of showing what we were talking about just a few minutes ago, that actually we get the formal agreements, but there's a discrepancy between the contact that goes on between the formal agreement and the contact that goes on that's outside of the formal agreement. And that's effectively that the adopters themselves are supervising or maintaining those relationships, rather than them coming as part of a court order or part of a contact plan that's arranged with an agency. And again, I think it really shows the effort and work that families are putting in to manage those arrangements for their children. Again, a lot of stories, I think, are hiding, a lot of people are hiding behind those numbers. So I was trying to wonder how I could answer the question of what's contact like for adoptive families. And I came up with a one-sentence answer, which is, how long is a piece of string? It varies so enormously from family to family. Some people have really complicated arrangements. Some people have really straightforward arrangements. Some people's experiences vary over time. Some people's start off bad, they get worse, then they vanish. Some people's experiences get better over time, and the relationships deepen and become more established. It really does seem to be quite a varied picture from what I have experienced. And I think that's because there's so many different moving parts. It's very hard to control for all of them, that we might... Sorry, somebody was calling me in the middle of that. Has my presentation gone now, or can you still see it? Is it back? Yeah, lovely. Sorry, somebody called me in the middle of that and it flicked my presentation off. So I think it's very hard to say. For me, what's important to say is that it's a big deal, whoever you are. It's important and it's significant because you're conscious of it, whether it's absent or present. If it's not there, I think a lot of people worry about, should I be doing more? Should I be facilitating this more? Is there something I could do to make it better? If it is there, it can be something that people put a lot of emotional energy into. People try really hard. People find it very stressful. People can live in, and kind of anticipation or dread of that yearly event when the letter is meant to arrive. I think it's a big deal and it can't be taken lightly, and I don't think people do take it lightly. And sharing your contact stories is probably a really good discussion to have in your community groups and with the people you know who've gone through similar. And I think it's a really big deal for children, and I think for a lot of parents, trying to future-proof and make sure that their decision is something that they can look their children in the eye and say, you know, I made these decisions, I made them with your best interest in heart, and I hope I got it right, is what matters most, that we're all thinking ahead of the game and we're trying to make sure that our children feel well served by any of these contact decisions that we're making. Simon and Emma, is it now a good time to invite you to just make another couple of comments perhaps about what it's like for adoptive families?
Thanks, Ellie. Hello, everybody. I think contact is, so the theory behind it and the actual nuts and bolts are fairly straightforward, but it's never straightforward, and everybody's individual implementation, the consistency or lack of consistency, makes it a hugely difficult area for families to pin down. And one of the most interesting things there from your presentation was how willing adoptive families are to actually maintain the contact. And to me, that speaks volumes about how important the recognition is for adopters about how birth families contact and maintaining that sense of identity for future, questions. Perhaps, there's that sense of a need for honesty with your children that is actually, feeds directly, contacts feeds directly into that. It's the discrepancies, isn't it? And it's the fact that there is so much inconsistency with contact. And there's an element here that you can try as hard as you like. You can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, almost. And what do you do actually when contact goes awry, or when it goes wrong, or when it stops? Because how are you supposed to fill the gaps for your child when you have basically nothing coming the other way? Because you know full well that when they become teenagers, or they start asking questions when they're pre-teens, or whenever they ask the questions, they expect you to have the answers. And if you're unable to offer the answers, then what problems does that then subsequently cause? Do they go and try and find the answers themselves? Do they move away from you as parents because they don't feel you're being honest with them, when that's very the opposite? It's such an individual thing. It's such, and there's a couple of questions that have popped up already that are proving how individual. The themes may be similar in some respects, but the individual experience of them are very, very, very different.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that moment of real responsibility, isn't it, Simon, where
absolutely
you feel responsible for how everybody else is behaving in a system you can't actually fully control.
Yes. Because I mean, it's quite easy to beat yourself up as an adoptive parent, when things are going well. So you
not just about contact, actually, but
absolutely. Oh gosh, absolutely. There are many steps to the process that make you extremely introspective, and a lot of it is just born for wanting the best for our children.
I think there's nothing in those statistics that show me anything other than people want to do right, and people want to try hard.
There's a perception thing here, though. I actually think that there is a wider societal perception that actually adopters don't want contacts to happen, though. I frequently come across that working with adult adoptees, particularly, who have maybe not had a very good experience because of how society treated their adoption 30 years ago or what have you. And it's a case of actually it's not an adopter problem particularly, but that doesn't make any difference to a family who's actually trying to maintain contact and it's not working how they would want it to. So I digress slightly.
No, I think I think it's spot on, that and that's what our data shows, isn't it? That's what our barometer shows, that there is goodwill and there is willingness within the community, and we've got to be proud of that. Emma, have you got any comments you'd like to make at this point?
Hello. Yeah, just to add the point about inconsistency and the struggle to be consistent with it. I think as far as we're concerned, we've always tried to be consistent. So I've kept a record of things, even if they weren't able to be sent. I've kept the copies of things. We had a couple of times where direct contact was arranged and scheduled, and then on the day it was cancelled. So I've kept for our adopted daughter, you know, the things I was going to take that day, so that I can just show her that we tried. We were always open. We were always willing, always careful, but yeah, always willing. And for the first 4 years, we didn't have any letterbox contact. It was arranged at the initiated, requested by our daughter's birth family, kind of a little bit out of the blue. But I'm really glad that I had actually written the letterbox letters for the years that I didn't get to send it, because that was really helpful, that I could actually, when it was requested, I could send the letters they would have had. But of course, you know, that may not have happened. It has happened, but I still, from our point of view, have always tried to be ready, be willing, be open, be careful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it sounds like you were trying to do the right thing regardless of what the system was asking of you. Is that?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and our daughter also has a half sibling who is in foster care, and just before she was placed with us, they had a face-to-face one-off meeting, our daughter and her older half sibling, and some photos were taken which are in her life storybook. And of course, we didn't know, but he had asked to have some letterbox contact, but then he moved foster placements, and it was decided that actually that wouldn't be very helpful for him, so it's never happened. But I do feel a little bit kind of poised and ready should he ever sort of try again, should it ever be considered that he is ready for that now. I want to, yeah, so I'm quite glad I've got those things saved on my computer. Just ready, and I'm hopeful that one day he'll receive the things I wasn't able to send at the time.
Yeah, I love that, because that tells me that same point that Simon was making, that it's not reluctance, it's not meanness of spirit on the part of the adoptive community, that even when it hasn't happened, we can demonstrate the goodwill and the generosity. And I think that's a really gorgeous message, I think. But there we go. I'll just move on. I've got a couple more slides, if I may.
Can I just come in very quickly, Ellie, before you do that? There's just been an interesting question being popped into the chat, or an interesting point being popped into the chat. Again, just kind of emphasising again, I think the willingness for adopters and how maybe things don't work how they would want it to work. Somebody's just popped something in there about a little bit of research or something that's come from, I don't know if it's an organisation called Pause. You'll probably know more about that, being down in England, than I do, sorry. But it's saying that over 70% of adoptive parents have never had their contact reviewed, despite them being open to maintaining relationships. And, you know, just a feeling that their need as parents, but also that of the adoptee, will have not been, you know, taken into account, or has not been reviewed or maintained. Because as our children grow up, then their needs change, obviously. So it's interesting that it's not just something that happens at the time that contact is set up. It is, as it always should be, an evolving process, which is also not reviewed.
Yeah, and I think that leads on to this Forest Gump slide beautifully, actually, because Pause is an organisation that works to support birth mothers who've had repeated removals of children to adoption and permanence. They do very important work, and it's a part of the equation that I hope starts to achieve some of the prominence that it needs within a system that has long neglected it. And I think we've got the capacity to talk about what contact is like for birth families. And I don't know, you know, that everybody's gathered around this webinar. I don't know what your expectations would be of how contact is experienced for birth families. But I worked with birth families for a number of years, and what that taught me was that it's incredibly conflicted, and it can be the thing that you look forward to most, but the thing that pains you most in any given year. And for people who are still in a state of grieving, it can become magnified and totemic for them. It is something that they can organize a lot of their hopes and fears around, and that's really difficult. So when you writing a letter can be hard. It can be hard from a really basic point of view that not everybody has the literacy to put pen to paper. Not everybody has the literacy to express themselves well. And even if you were a very literate person, explaining yourself well to people you have a really conflicted relationship with is very loaded, very difficult. And these are probably some of the emotions that we would find hardest to voice and articulate, because we're talking about, you know, deep primal fears and scars that and pains that people have got to somehow put across. And then when those letters go out, you have no idea how they're going to be received. You don't know whether people are going to read that and judge you, or say, look, see, this is why you deserve to have your children taken off you, or whether people are going to say, oh, that poor woman, I feel so bad for her. You know, you have no idea how that letter is going to be received, and you don't know whether the child is going to read the letter or not. So it's a very vulnerable, very fragile, really exposed position to assume as a birth parent. And I would say getting it right feels pretty impossible in that situation. And then getting letters rejected, which is not uncommon at all, it can land really hard for people. And that's not to say that the rejection of the letters is wrong. I'm not judging that part of it, but the consequence of that letter being rejected, it can be quite devastating for people, because they've been trying to say a thing, and then the thing that they tried to say got knocked back. And it was the story that they wanted to tell. And there's lots of rules that are put in around indirect contact, such as you can't refer to yourself as mum or dad, you can't refer to your bad things in your life, but equally you can't ask too many questions about somebody when you're not going to get a response for another year. You know, there are really big traps in for people, so it's very, very complicated, but equally it is the only line of access they have to have an understanding of the child. And without the contact, all they've got is their own imaginations, and your own imagination isn't always your best friend when you've experienced a trauma. So I suppose I have nothing but empathy for how difficult it is. But that's a hell of a responsibility to put on the adopter on the other end of it, isn't it? To look after yourself, to look after your children, to think about your children's future, and then to take empathy for another adult somewhere else who you perhaps have met once at a meet the parent, meet the adopter session. You know, these are big jobs, big emotional jobs that we're asking people to go through. And as Simon said, it might happen right at the beginning once, and we never ever go back and we never look at it. So that's very complicated. And I suppose the other complicated part of it is that this, you know, kind of for the various different people. So if you've been given letterbox contacts, they're different from if you've got photos, and it's different from if you've got if you're being allowed some direct contact, or it's different if you're having sibling contact as opposed to birth parent contact. So it's a tricky web to get right for all those different people. So if I may, having talked about the different parts of contact, I wanted to raise this idea that there is a way of doing contact which can be about taking a moment to think about your child and where they are in the year, thinking about how you know, what record you want, as Emma was saying, you know, thinking about keeping that, preserving that little time capsule as you go for your child, making contact a reflective moment, thinking about the other people and how it lands, thinking about what the child will want to get from it as they're a teenager, as they're an adult, as they become a parent themselves, trying to think over the life course and take all those things into account when you're considering your contact arrangements. What I thought was important really was to say that we can, when we deal with organisations, reduce contact to a transaction, and it can become, this is my contact agreement and you're only entitled to one letter once a year and it can't be on your birthday or Christmas because that's too triggering. And I think we are capable of putting the heart and the humanity back into contact, and I think we'll do that by striving for this idea of reflective contact. But as I said, you might think that's too big an ask, and you might think I'm being overly ambitious there. And then my next slide is my get out of jail free slide, and you'll be glad to know it's the end of my slideshow. I just wanted to say that I would love to be able to write you the formula that says this is the right amount of contact for a 1-year-old, for a 5-year-old, for a 10-year-old, and for a 15-year-old. Wouldn't that be gorgeous to be able to offer you those sorts of promises? But I'm afraid I think the reality is a little more difficult than that, and it's a little bit more nuanced because we've just got so many different people to take into account. And I think the individuality of your family and your children is what you need to take into account when determining what the right level of contact is. You know whether your children are asking questions that they deserve certain answers for. You know whether they would be able to manage those answers. You know whether you have the words to tell them those answers in the right way. You know whether they've got the emotional resilience to deal with rejection or disappointment or overexcitement. Your knowledge of your children and yourselves is going to be the best guide you have for determining what is the right contact for you and your family. Now, I do apologise that that isn't a very clear-cut answer, but I think it's the principle that underpins the answers, which is do the reflective work, know your children, and turn that knowledge into answers rather than trying to look for some outside authority with the rule book, because the rule book will never actually talk about your child. Only you can ever do that. Shall I stop sharing, Jo? Is that the right thing to do?
I think so, and then we'll get to see more of your faces. Thank you for that, Ellie. That was really good. Thank you. Thank you for the questions that have come in. So we'll start addressing those. So we've got one question. I'm experienced with letterbox contact, but really want to hear about direct contact in later teenage years and the risk assessments around this and what support is available.
Hi. Thank you, whoever asked that question. You've started me off right with a hard one. There's no rules, and lots of agencies don't necessarily formally support that. So I think in the first instance is talk to your agency, whether that's in England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, wherever you happen to be, talk to your agency and find out what their policy and their position is, because some people will have a really clear-cut policy, and some people will just say no, we don't do that, we wait until they're adults and then they can do search and reunion on their own, and you'll find everything in between. So find out what's true in your area, and then in your response to that, my advice would be really write down on a piece of paper and bolt down what your reasons are and why you think it would be useful and beneficial for your child. And if you've worked that out, then you can have a proper thorough conversation. And I wouldn't necessarily rely on just the agency to do the risk assessment. I would want to do my own assessment of my own child and talk about you know, what from your knowledge as a parent, what's going to be in their best interest. The reason though that the agencies will ultimately need to do some of their own risk assessment is that you won't have knowledge and won't be able to have thorough and impartial knowledge of the other side of the equation. So that's where your agency can help you to get information about birth family circumstances and whether risks are still operational. For a lot of families though, what they've found themselves in is this kind of putting the cart before the horse type of scenarios, where it's the child, especially teenagers with social media access, they've actually managed to go ahead and make contact. So then the risk assessment becomes slightly different, and the risk assessment becomes, how do we try and put some safety back around this situation now that we're in the position that we're in. So depending on whether this is a, I'd like to think about it and let's do it in a planned way, or whether it's a, oh dear, we happen to be in this situation, quick, everybody, let's make it as safe as we can way, will really make a decision making process much more clear. And then what I would always anticipate is that a good risk assessment will lead to a good plan, and a good plan will always be incremental with tests and measures against it. So if you start off with you know, discussions with the child, and then you test, you know, kind of, and then you see how those discussions have gone down, and then you talk about what would the child like to do next, and then you think about the realities of the child's plan and the child's willingness, and you just test as you go, so that you, at no point are you dropping somebody into a massively unexpected, here you are with 16 of your birth family members on your own with none of your supports around you, nightmare. That we're testing people's tolerances, and then we're testing the impact of that change, so that nobody is asked to deal with things that are beyond their coping points, and they're aware of the supports that we put them in. So I mean, as a person, what I would like to say is that it's not just the risk assessment, it's the support that you put in around it as well. So it's sending that really clear message that if we're going to do this, you know that I'm going to be here and supporting you, and however you feel about it, you know, if you want to stop, I will respect your want to stop, and I will give you the backup to do that. And it's taking that emotional responsibility for young people and children, so it's so that they know that this is a managed process by us as their carers, that they know that we are going to put that care in really quite powerfully. But that's a long and very social worky answer. Simon, Emma, have you got anything else to comment about that?
Well, I think you prepare for both eventualities, because social media is so all prevalent these days that it is almost inevitable at some degree that there'll be some curiosity there possibly at some point, and I think so there's a couple of things around preparing for both eventualities and expecting them both to exist. One is, I mean, you were talking about safeguards there, but one is start the conversation as early as is appropriate and in using appropriate language. The best, I mean, with the best within the world, not that you would ever want this to happen, but there is, you know, you will never be able to stop your child from looking on social media or seeking things out. So the best way to equip them with that, I mean, it's all right talking about risk assessments and things like that, but it's actually creating the safe environments that they feel they can share things with you as their parent, and as their child, so that you can explore that part of the journey together. And I mean, you touched on it there, Ellie, as well, about, you know, being able to have conversations when it's right with the wee one, and it's you building that relationship constantly. Contact just isn't a once a year thing. You know, the physicality of it is, but actually the thinking before it and the thinking after it lasts a lot longer than the actual writing of the letter. So, you know, the worst possible outcome is that the wee one has this ability to create what they think is going to be what they expect to find when they contact their birth family independently. And it turns out to be nothing like what they expected. You know, this fantasy, you know, your mind has this great way of creating something that it wants to see, and successful contact, you know, counters the disappointments, the crushing disappointment sometimes if the children go on their own and actually find things out that really aren't what they want to find, and they feel they have no support to pick that up. So I think I've spoken and used a lot of words there when I probably didn't need to use a lot of words to agree with everything that you've said. But prepare for both, and try from as early age as possible. And I appreciate to some people that are out there listening today that it's not actually going to be possible because they're already at the teenage stage. My daughter is nearly 16, and you know, we're very much mindful of the fact that the existing birth family is still not a million miles away from where we live at the moment. So although she has shown no apparent interest of trying to find them out, contact hasn't been particularly successful for our family. You know, she spends hours in her bedroom because she's a teenager with her phone and her laptop. So who knows what's actually going on sometimes. So, you know, risk assessments for both outcomes, building relationships around contact, creating those security networks, having honest conversations about what the reality of the situation is, and what the birth family situation is within the information that you have, because again, you're quite right, you don't always get to know what's going on. And it's not always appropriate to share all of the reports, the LAC reports and all the rest of it from when the V1 was still in care. So I think that's me. I think.
No, I really love that, Simon, because it's, I mean, what I've pulled out from that is it's a relationship opportunity, isn't it? You know,
absolutely.
Whether it's good, bad or indifferent, you can use it to deepen
Absolutely.
your relationship with your child, even if the child is, you know, throwing you off the boat and, you know, kind of, and heading off into the sunset. Is still a really good opportunity for you to do that relationship communication about still here, still being about.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you know, and it's seeing opportunity in adversity, I suppose, in some respects. But you know, there's an element of being a teenager and being an older child, and even being a preteen sometimes, that independence, that controlling aspect of what many of our children like to do, that hypervigilance, that need to know, you know, every opportunity to build that relationship and ensure that they can be kept safe, even if they throw it back in your face. You know, they might not engage with, but they'll still hear the words.
Yeah, absolutely. Lands whether they want to or not, doesn't it?
Well, indeed. You can always hear, but you don't need to listen.
Yeah. Emma, I'm sure Simon and I are over talking you. Is there anything you wanted to come up on?
Well, it's just one thing we've done, which I have found helpful, is that I've searched for them just using the internet search. So I haven't kind of tried to find birth family on social media, but through just putting in their names, we have gained quite a lot of information, which I'm really glad that I've been able to print out. It's newspaper articles for various things that have happened, and some photographs. And I'm glad that I've done it. It's hard, but at least I know what she would find if she were to ever type their names into a search bar. So I've printed those things off. So yeah, I haven't dared to find them on social media because I was worried that I might pop up as someone you might know. So I've never done that. You know what I mean? This person's really interested in you. So I've never done that. But just searching, I mean, basically Googling them, I have found some information, which I'm just glad we know before she does it. Yeah.
And forewarned is forearmed, isn't it? Absolutely. There's that, you know, I mean, I'm also impressed, Emma, that you think that your ability to find information on the internet will ever beat the children's, because let's be honest, most of us can probably only just, you know, kind of find the John Lewis website and order things off Amazon. So they're going to blow us out of the water with what they can find.
It's true. That's true.
Well done for the ambition there.
I like the way that it was the John Lewis website and it wasn't like the Pound Stretcher website. I think that was very good. I suppose that there is a question here actually, and I don't know if this is the right place to discuss it even, but should you do that, but then you discover that someone has died, or there is some other extraordinarily significant, you know, effects, you know, something that's happened, what do you then do with that information? And I'm not sure quite what the answer is, because again, it comes down to every individual family, doesn't it? And you know, you don't want to be accused of holding on to information that the person had a right to know. Just because contact has broken down, you know, it's a tough one. Both of my daughter's birth parents have died, and she knows that, but that was potentially a really tricky moment in everybody's lives. Obviously the effect on her could have been extraordinary, but she dealt with it with quite a lot of resilience. But it was a case of, what if we discovered that independently? You know, how would we have broached that subject? You know, she was quite young when it happened, so
yeah. I suppose my answer to that is that if you do come across big information from your own research, then would be go back to the authorities and see if you can fact check that information before you before you do anything with it, because the internet is a tricky place and not all the information on the internet is entirely factually accurate. So
the master of understatement.
I'm trying to be moderate, Simon. But what I would like, you know, what I think there is, I mean, obviously birth families having those sorts of tragedies is not uncommon at all. And again, they're really good relationship moments to, I mean, I've seen many adopters weeping for the lives that birth families have lived and the you know, the tragedies they've endured. So when you find those things out, I think it is a moment where you can just have that person-to-person empathy and care. But before you do anything with that information, I would caution everybody to go work from a position of fact and knowledge. And then once you're sure of your own facts and knowledge, you know, you can then think best how to share and deliver that with children. It's because effectively you're then stepping into the role of parent and intermediary counselling. And that's, you know, birth record counselling is a skilled role as well. So lots of, again, this goes back to our campaigning ask, doesn't it, that people need the training and they need the support, because actually what we're asking people to do is enormously complex professional jobs, and you're just meant to do that off the cuff as a parent, without necessarily having, you know, the framework to help you know how to do that best and right. So yeah, proceed with caution and check your facts would be would be my starting point there.
We do have another question.
Please.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Could you talk about how to deal with contact from older siblings who are not adopted? What would the advice be?
Oh, well, I would start with think about your child, and I know that sounds like the get out, but what's your child telling you, either in words or in their behavior? You will hear horror stories about people having contact with older siblings, and when it's people having contact with older siblings where there is a level of contact between the sibling and the birth parents, often people are fearful that opens a door to a broader network of contact that's hard to put back in place. And I think it's probably realistic to say that you can prepare your child, but you can't control the sibling. So the sibling then wants to go off and make introductions or have conversations and so on and so forth. That's going to be really tricky for you to manage that. My experience of adopted young people is that the sibling relationship is often the relationship that they feel a great deal of interest and lure to, that they're very attracted to seeing themselves as part of a sibling group. So I would really want to understand the importance of that sibling relationship to the child, and if you're then in a position of having to think about making that direct contact, indirect contact or direct contact, then sometimes what people do is they find ways of doing it that prevents there sort of being a backtrackable route to that. So you might meet in a neutral location. So you might, you know, you don't necessarily live in the same place. So you might go to Derbyshire and have a lovely weekend, you know, kind of and meet there and take it offline effectively and allow the relationship to exist within a bubble. And that can, if you're concerned about other extended members of the family who that child might be in contact, or that sibling might be in contact, then you can try and put a little bit of a bubble around that contact to protect there. So some people find that useful. I would also urge people to think a little bit about, though as well, and it sounds like a contradiction, about how much you want to control that relationship and how much you want to let that relationship, once it's started, to follow the rules of itself, rather than trying to manage that process as well. And that's where you have to come down to really knowing your child, knowing how responsible your child is, how vulnerable and impressionable your child is, whether your child is secretive, whether they value their independence, whether they are thrill seekers, or whether they are poor judges of character. You know, think about your child, and then the safeguards you put in are linked to that child and how they behave. But they won't always thank you for trying to manage and organize the relationship. That once you've taken the stopper out of the bottle and the genie is out, then often young people are going to want to be self-determined in those relationships. So I'd think very carefully. And again, I think that's an opportunity for the parent to have a conversation with a child that says, this is how we want it to jointly go forward, because most children will understand your concerns, even if they don't want to be controlled, even if they don't want to be managed. So I think that's really useful to have a think about. Simon and Emma, do you agree with me, or have I been too permissive there?
No, I don't think so at all. I think that what you're saying there is spot on, and there is an allure there, isn't there? And again, I would just go back to earlier comments that people have said about, you know, being as open and honest throughout the whole experience of bringing your child up, so that there aren't really any surprises, as much within the knowledge that you have, so that should an older sibling get in touch, then, you know, it's not like, oh, I never knew I had an older sibling. It's a case of, oh yeah, such and such, and then they live with this person, and they live here in this part of the world, and all of this kind of stuff. And yes, it might be quite interesting, because I have some questions that I want to ask of them that I couldn't ask elsewhere. You know, mum, dad, what can you do with me to actually ensure that happens? And that kind of conversation, which is, gosh, the gold standard that'll never happen, is something that you have to build up on over years. But it's quite interesting, because it's an older sibling that's not adopted as a direct line to birth family. You know, it's like picking up the back phone. You know, there's no interference, there's nothing, there's no social work interference, there's no parental interference with that. It is a direct line. And again, that's maybe another situation that you best approach by discussing it as a possibility, if it is a possibility, if there are older siblings or what have you. And you know, our children don't necessarily deal very well with surprises, or things that are suddenly put on their plates that become really exciting and glittery, and grass is greener on the other side, and all of those kind of connotations. So yeah, preparation is key, and as much as possible trying to gatekeep a little bit, as much as you possibly can. Yeah, tricky.
Emma, did you have anything to add, or are you in the joyous position that yours are too young to answer this question?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ellie, Emma and Simon, for your time this afternoon. Thank you, those of you joining us. We do have some ones that popped in the chat that Beth Neal's got some good resources on practice with contact. And we do have a Beth Neal webinar available on our members resources area, if that's something you want to visit. We have several webinars on contact, if this is an area of interest to you and your family, that you can go and visit a later date. But thank you so much for those who've participated with your questions and your comments this afternoon. Thank you to our panelists, and this will all be recorded and available to view by the end of tomorrow. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.